a few questions here that I'll walk through and ask the panel to jump in and answer, and then we'll just go through them in order. So the first question was, has there been any consideration given to HUD or emergency use pathways?
In terms of breakthrough, is that?
There's not any expanded.
Okay. I mean, just in general, the SHIP concept is intended to apply to all of the pathways that I have listed on the previous slide. But, you know, I'll just point out that the breakthrough designation right now is silent on HDE. It's just for PMA and 510K de novo. So there is a gap there in the breakthrough designation program that currently exists.
There was a follow-up related question that says, how does FDA differentiate breakthrough pathway from compassionate use, emergency use, and HUD pathways?
Nicole, do you want to take that? Or?
Yeah. So I can start, and then Minerva, if you would like to add or maybe correct anything I might say. So I think we see them as fairly separate programs. The breakthrough designation is really about identifying innovations that are safe and more effective, potentially more effective than existing technologies. And it's a designation that the innovator would apply for can apply for at any time up until the point of a marketing submission, and is considered at any point before that. And so it's really a program that's designed at encouraging innovation and addressing unmet needs in the clinical community. I would say that the compassionate use and emergency use pathways are really aimed at, they're part of the expanded access program, and they're aimed at not necessarily a broad designation or broad use, but it's really for very patient-specific use of a device, and as a, sort of an option when there are no alternatives available. So it's very patient-specific as opposed to breakthrough, which is more of a population-specific program. The HUD program, I would say, is then maybe in a third separate bucket, and that's a designation that's aimed at devices that treat very small populations, less than 8,000 patients per year for devices. And that designation, again, I think is something that's considered prior to submission of a marketing application, and is a separate program entirely. I don't know if I've addressed the question quite well enough, but Minerva, if you have anything to add, please go ahead.
No, thanks, Nicole. I think you did a really good job of summarizing the different programs and really highlighting the different purposes of those programs as well. When we're talking about compassionate use, as you mentioned, and emergency use, these are expanded access to investigational products. And the presumption is oftentimes clinical studies are ongoing for those products. And so the question is sort of raising that there probably would be those scenarios that might come up, for a sponsor that's engaged in SHIP where there might be a compassionate use request or issue, how we might deal with that. That's something for us to sort of think about because it's not an uncommon scenario, and it will be something to factor in. But one of the things I wanted to flag around the discussion around the HUD and the HDE program and breakthrough devices is just sort of a reminder that, oftentimes as part of the development program, there's an opportunity to think about sort of the HDE as a step in the process. It's one way of getting products on the market a little bit earlier. The regulatory threshold for approval is a little bit different. But what the SHIP MD infrastructure has the opportunity to offer is that the potential for that clinical evidence infrastructure to really streamline the process of moving from sort of the initial HDE approval to actually getting towards a full PMA. And so there's opportunities there still within the SHIP MD, if that's where the question was getting at, to how we might think about the HDE program in HUD, separate from the breakthrough aspects of it.
Great, thank you. Francesca, during your talk, there was a slide that spoke to the pediatric age range cutoffs. So one question came in, what are the pediatric age range cutoffs for medical devices based on? Could you provide a little clarity there?
I think it's anatomical. Body isn't fully grown in some cases, especially in males until that age. I think that was the primary, but maybe my FDA colleagues can back me up on that.
I see Minerva waving.
Yes, there are certainly differences in the range, as Francesca was mentioning. But for us in the agency, there's also a statutory directive that's defining those subpopulations that's driving that definition as well, just for additional context.
So Minerva, maybe one other follow-up to that. What about the situation when drugs and devices are used together?
When drugs or devices, maybe you can expand a little bit. Are you talking about a combination product or
yes.
Separate? Okay, so for combination products, if we're talking about a combination product, the combination product, even though you might have a drug or device, there's typically a lead product based on its primary mode of action. So the development program would either reside within CDRH under the PMA or reside within the Center for Drugs under the NDA, consulting as you would expect with the appropriate centers. And so the pediatric age range from the device really comes into play, as Francesca mentioned earlier, when we're thinking about labeling. And so if you're talking about a PMA-led combination product, it would certainly come up in that context. Does that answer your question?
That's really helpful. And we had another question to the panel. Are the champions employees of CPATH or ShipMD, or are they sponsors?
They're not sponsors from the innovator of the product that they're being assigned to, but they're part of the ShipMD kind of knowledge base, knowledge that can be pulled as needed, for these, depending on the device. So it's somebody who has the expertise that's specific to the product and the disease at hand. Not employed by the company who's developing said device. It would be an independent, but through the ShipMD.
Great, thank you. That's really helpful. Another question. With the involvement of the FDA liaison, presumably not a lead reviewer, and external champion, how do you ensure that the review team is able to perform an objective review?
I can maybe start answering that question. So I think that the concept of the FDA liaison is primarily as a means of making sure that there's communication and the sort of benefit risk principles in evaluating a pediatric device are present in the interactions. And so that the liaison may not necessarily be the lead reviewer, and they may not be part of the formal review team, but they will act as a representative to be able to support the review team, to be able to engage and make sure there's, an open line between ShipMD and FDA, so that as a means to sort of facilitate the interactions. So the liaison, I think that, part of the question was about making sure that the review team, can conduct an independent review. So the review team will remain independent, but, would be supported by the liaison when needed.
Okay. Kind of a related question is, will membership in ShipMD offer benefits at FDA in terms of access not open to others and be seen to create a two-tiered system? Nicole, look what you want to ask.
Yeah, I can start. Anyone else would like to jump in. So I'll first maybe just emphasize that these are all concepts at this stage, and part of the purpose of the meeting these 3 days is to really get input, audience input, and stakeholder input on not only the concepts that we've presented, but perhaps any others that that folks feel are important for this type of effort. So I think I would say that a number, so it's comparing maybe an innovator that would go through ShipMD versus an innovator that perhaps would not choose to go through ShipMD. Would they have access to different opportunities or different things from a regulatory perspective between those two scenarios? You know, I think that the concept of the ship champion is different. And I think the concept of an FDA liaison is a little bit different. The innovator that didn't perhaps pursue a ShipMD pathway still is assigned a lead reviewer, still has the opportunity to interact with the lead reviewer and to, you know, submit pre-submissions as they normally would and interact with the review team as they normally would. But I would say perhaps doesn't necessarily have the link between the champion and the liaison. So I think there are some unique characteristics of what's being proposed here that have the potential to sort of facilitate the regulatory interaction a little bit better. That was the concept. If anyone else from the workstream would like to comment, please do.
If not, we'll go on to another question. This was a little bit of a change in gears. Some of our innovators are having trouble with setting up UPI design controls and quality systems. Is there any chance to assist with these concerns with ShipMD?
I can try to attempt it. I don't know if Eric want to chime in too on this. But so I think primarily our working group has focused on the clinical aspects of the regulatory process, as well as the sort of more, I would say, regulatory-based interactions up to this point. It doesn't mean that, you know, we couldn't explore thinking about assistance on the manufacturing side or assistance on the, you know, verification and validation type support. I know it's definitely come up in our conversation. It just wasn't part of sort of our initial phase of formulating some proposals, but it's certainly something that we could explore.
Great. Another related question. More than 90% of the devices are not Class 3, so what can be done to help many more innovators that are not making such high profile but infrequent breakthrough products?
Maybe I can jump in. I'll provide some industry standpoints on it. So, you know, I think the work that the team has come up with regards to the regulatory work stream is going to be beneficial for all medical devices. And while the example that was given during the slide deck today focused on the pediatric heart valve, that is not to say that ShipMD would only be beneficial for those, you know, Class 3 high-risk medical devices. I think there's possibilities of, you know, Class 2 medical devices also, you know, getting support through ShipMD, whether it's from, you know, a clinical standpoint or perhaps some type of preclinical standpoint or even animal advice. Now, when we do talk about Class 2 medical devices, one should also recall that the agency gets a large number of these types of submissions, and between less than 10% of those require clinical data. And so when we're talking about a Class 2 medical device, in general, manufacturers are demonstrating substantial equivalence to a predicate device that's already on the market. And so not to say that those medical devices would not have a benefit through ShipMD, I think they would. It would be on the burden of the manufacturer, the sponsor of the medical device, to approach ShipMD to determine at what time point within the timeline that the manufacturer or sponsor would be interested in receiving feedback as well as suggestions through the help of ShipMD. So it is not designed specifically only towards Class 3 medical devices.
And the case study presentations from yesterday included an example of a 510K device. So I would urge anyone who wasn't able to join live to watch that recording.
Great, thank you.
You know, weren't able to attend some of the other presentations. I mean, one of the things that was highlighted in the hospital in earlier talks is that, you know, with the ShipMD, we're really trying to create sort of a new system of hospitals to support, you know, clinical evidence generation, and not necessarily to duplicate or replicate existing processes that might be already at play and that might be already working well. And so, you know, in the case of, you know, certain regulatory questions early on that aren't bringing up clinical, or that might be tapping into, sort of, I know the quality systems question, you know, this is very early on, and all proposals are great. We want to hear that feedback. But at the same time, you know, we also want you to sort of think about, you know, what's really needed to move the system forward. And if we have, you know, good infrastructures already in place supporting sort of those regulatory consulting or quality systems types activity, is that the best place for SHIP, you know, as part of us trying to move the initiative forward.
Great. A little bit of a gear change. How are devices for the fetus handled?
So by the current definition, they are not considered pediatric because it's from birth to 22. So.
Okay, good. About a process question here. FDA often requires long-term GLP animal studies. Should companies apply for the SHIP program prior to beginning these studies?
Yeah, I think there was a little, at the bottom of that timeline, we have the little caveat that it'll depend on the product, on where you want to enter SHIP. So it depends on the needs of the developer. But it's flexible. It was intended to be as proposed. I don't know if anyone else wants to add.
Yeah, I think, you know, from this is Derek, I think that's a good question, and it depends on, you know, the time frame that the sponsor or manufacturer is wanting to seek advice or strategy work from ShipMD, right? You know, perhaps if there's a medical device in which the sponsor or innovator is having uncertainty when it comes to particular animal model for using for the medical device, perhaps that might be an opportunity for that individual or innovator to enter into ShipMD. Alternatively, if animal studies have already been completed and there's questions when it comes to the type of preclinical testing that may need to be required that the agency is looking for, that can also be another opportunity for an innovator to enter ShipMD. And so we would recommend that, you know, innovators who are interested in participating in being able to use this particular proposal to help us think about at what point you know, we should continue to move this project forward. Right now, this is in the pre-formational stage, and so we're taking feedback from the audience as well as others to help us be able to better design this program to bring a type of ecosystem that will help for pediatric medical devices.
Eric, a related question in the same stream was, is there any effort to reduce the burden or cost for these animal studies for SHIP participants?
You know, that's a really good question, you know, and it ends up being dependent on, you know, the type of animal model that you're doing, as well as perhaps the type of requirements that FDA may put in for GLP animal studies. And so it's a question that I'm not sure if I have an answer to. I think, you know, the purpose of ShipMD is to try to reduce the uncertainty as well as to enhance the time frame of getting pediatric medical devices to children. And so the purpose of this whole conversation, as well as this workshop, is to be creative, think outside the box, or think in a different box on ways of bringing forth these types of medical devices for children. And I think the feedback that we've gotten so far today has been great. You know, if we can all be able to pursue a solution in which we meet the unmet needs of pediatric patients, that's consistent with the mission that all of us have, as well as with the mission of FDA. And so I think these are all great comments. I'm not sure I have I don't have a clear answer as to whether it's going to reduce burden or costs. That's something that, of course, we would want to investigate more on.
Another process question, would liaisons be available to assist with and or review submissions in any regulatory filings?
I think that the question is related to the FDA liaison.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think, as I mentioned before, I think that the role of the liaison was intended to be, separate or different, I should say, from the review team. And so the primary review would still, reside within the review office and would be, the responsibility of the review team. So they wouldn't necessarily, the liaison wouldn't necessarily be reviewing or pre-reviewing submissions per se, but I would venture to say that the other support areas that SHIP would provide, so for example, the SHIP champion could help facilitate, the information that goes into a particular submission. So for example, I mentioned that if there's an argument to be made for benefit risk argument to be made, or arguments to be made for support of a breakthrough designation, I think that's where the SHIP champion would come in terms of support for putting together regulatory submissions in that respect.
Great, that's very clear. Another related question is, are there opportunities to integrate international studies and evidence into a program within the SHIP framework? Is there plans for that kind of linkage to be considered as part of the program?
I think we included on one of the slides, really utilizing existing data. So, included in that could be, OUS, not to say there'd be a guarantee or anything, but certainly something to explore.
Okay, good point. Another question, a meaningful proportion of pediatric medical interventions happen in an office setting outside the hospital. Is SHIP-MD planning to support devices that are used in hospitals only or in this other environment?
This came up a little bit in the hospital criteria presentation. So, again, I would urge you to either watch the recording or maybe join tomorrow. But the hub and spoke model that's proposed, that did come up, where the hubs would be like these major hospitals that have the infrastructure, but then could they add a spoke, some sort of partner in their health system that's more on the outpatient side? That certainly could be a possibility, and did come up in conversation. There just was no answer yet. So I'm glad it's a recurring theme, because definitely something that we'll consider.
Good. How do you envision the regulatory component of SHIP-MD ensuring that a single clinical trial strategy will lead to both clearance and reimbursement? Is it through the interaction with a liaison?
The liaison doesn't have a role in reimbursement per se. But again, the reimbursement work stream went into this in detail. So, would urge, linking in with that. But there's a lot to it. It's complicated. The FDA, it's through CMS usually, and then private payers that work the reimbursement. But FDA, conversations and approval all go into that. But it's a complex milieu, and hopefully the SHIP-MD is intended to try to keep the people who need to communicate communicating. And then on the part of, if there needs to be some legislative action, lobbying to move things in those directions to really link reimbursement, because that is such an important piece, then, we want to hear from everybody and kind of come up with ways how SHIP-MD can be helpful in that area, because it's all interconnected.
Any other thoughts from the panel members? I have a few other questions, but just to give you all a chance to kind of react to some of the questions that we've scrolled through. Anybody we haven't heard from? Okay, another question. Will the ship direct or prescribe in any way the regulatory process and mechanisms for products that utilize the ship?
Quick answer is no. They're non-binding recommendations. And doesn't guarantee approval either.
Will participation in the ship confer favorable FDA decision-making with respect to final clearance or approval? There's a loaded question.
No. It's a loaded question, but no. I mean, ShipMD is really, an advisory group helping to support the process. They're not a regulatory body. They're not influencing the regulatory decision. They're not changing the thresholds or standards that FDA has to support marketing approval. As Nicole mentioned before, there are, folks that don't engage in SHIP certainly continue to have opportunities to engage with FDA. We do have a robust interactive review program, but there are still certain benefits for SHIP in terms of facilitating and sort of de-risking and helping to streamline that process, but it's not a regulatory, and it's interesting those questions are coming up, and we do want to make that clear that there isn't sort of that regulatory advantage with respect to SHIP.
Thanks, Minerva, appreciate that. Will the products of hospital, company, or individual innovators that utilize the SHIP be required to stay within the limited SHIP network for a longer period of time than is necessary to obtain clearance or approval by FDA, i.e. beyond the time for initial marketing authorization?
No, as it's proposed, you can enter and exit whenever you choose.
Another question, there are professional study groups that are highly active doing clinical studies in specific areas by using very large registries and databases. Do you see a possible collaboration between ShipMD and these study groups?
Absolutely.
I think yeah.
Please go ahead, Nicole.
I'm sorry. Please add anything that I missed. I think this did come up in our Workstream conversations. I think there's an opportunity to take advantage of the network of hospitals and the registries that exist at those institutions to be able to support, at least from my perspective, some of the regulatory requirements. So, for example, you may go through SHIP and you may end up at a point of approval or clearance or granting of your de novo. But there may be some post-market requirement that's needed for additional data collection, and so there could be an opportunity to make use of that infrastructure on a registry, from a registry perspective, to help gather some of that post-market data. So it's certainly something that we've talked about and probably needs some further development, but I do think there's potential there.
Great. We had one other question. Have there Have there been any discussions around ShipMD having international element collaborations, or will this be a solely U.S.-focused organization? I think people just want confirmation of that.
National, as the current proposal exists, I don't know if anyone's opposed to broadening, but for now, just within the U.S.
Okay. Will the SHIP direct or prescribe in any way the regulatory process and mechanisms for products that utilize the SHIP? And I think this is, again, a little bit, we've covered this, but just for confirmation.
Yeah, so prescribed, no. Suggested, yes. So assistance, but not non-binding advice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think folks can, and just to add to the point that Francesca's made, I think we can think about ShipMD as a collective group of experts with backgrounds in pediatric medical devices, whether it's clinical, perhaps perhaps engineering, animal, IRB, clinical trial design. I think that can be a catch-all for some of the folks that are listening today, thinking about the concept of how ShipMD can be helpful for the pediatric innovator. Now, I'm leaving certain aspects of it out because I don't want to prescribe that this is all that ShipMD is capable of. As we hear about the questions as well as the recommendations from the audience and others, we can use that information to go beyond the pre-consortium stage, use this information to be able to finalize what the framework of ShipMD can be as it's established, as well as to roll out perhaps the full consortium when it is ready to be launched for participants to submit their proposals or to participate in any ways. But I think we don't want to limit the possibility of ShipMD as well. I don't think we want to get into a situation where we're going to be promising that we're going to boil the ocean, right? That's a big concept to understand, and it's not to say that we won't get there. But I think we're proposing to take small steps for now in a efficient manner so that we can bring, pediatric medical devices to the market. And as folks saw the presentation that Francesca gave, we're on a very slow slope when it comes to development of bringing pediatric medical devices to market. And from a manufacturer standpoint, a large medical device company, it is our pursuit of bringing life-changing technology to people who need them, whether it's adults, pediatrics, or, all patients. And so today I think we're trying to present a concept of how we can address the unmet needs as it comes to pediatric medical devices and be able to move this entire pediatric ecosystem into the next phase of the process.
Yeah, and I agree. And some of it's out there. There's guidance documents from FDA about real-world evidence and extrapolation. But, just publishing it and actually linking the community that needs that information and everybody understanding it, is something ShipMD can help facilitate. And even just the resource portal being just an education hub where innovators can go and see if anything there is relevant to what they're thinking about.
I think you hit the nail on the head, Francesca, with respect to community. I think that's where it's been lacking in coming through with all of these questions, just a little bit of fear of uncertainty around this. So I think the newness of it is something that hopefully over time will be cemented by the actions of the organization. Any concluding thoughts by any of the other panel members? We kind of went through all the questions. Any other comments from any of the other panel members?
Jeff Rosenthal, I'm one of the EC members. I'm representing the AAP. I just want to say I think this session has been really outstanding. The regulatory processes and the way that SHIP will dovetail with them without fundamentally changing the regulatory framework, I think it's hard to talk through, but I think the panelists have done a great job helping the participants on the Zoom today to sort of understand what is the SHIP concept and what is it not. In what ways will it advantage innovators, and in what ways can it not, by virtue of not changing the sort of the fundamental regulatory framework. So I just want to say that I think there have been some great questions that have come from the audience, as it were, and I think the panelists have done a wonderful job addressing them. So good job, everybody.
Thanks, Jeff. Much appreciated. Francesca, Nicole, any final words?
No, I just want to thank everybody for their participation. Great questions. And looking forward to further discussion as the day ends and continues tomorrow.